Please give me money on Patreon. Dinner time. The time of good food. Fine wine. Chatting with friends. Asking your sister to murder her cop girlfriend that's trying to hunt you down. Oh. Arcane, the dinner scene. Why dinner? Why not supper? Why not kill everyone? Why kill anyone? That brings us to talking about schizophrenia. And specifically how it's depicted in Arcane and other media. Jinx is probably the highest profile example of a schizophrenic character outside of a murder mystery cop show. And while she does fall into some of the tropes of schizophrenia, like being violent and unpredictable, she is clearly a character crafted with a lot of care and attention, which turns these qualities from crazy, violent, maniac girl to human being who happens to hear voices and maybe does a little violence, just for fun.
What is schizophrenia?
Most people know schizophrenia as a mental illness that causes hallucinations, typically depicted as violent and terrifying auditory hallucinations. But schizophrenia actually has a lot of symptoms, categorized as positive and negative. Now, these aren't moral judgments on these symptoms. You can't be like a better or a worse schizophrenic, but positive basically means the presence of exaggerated symptoms, whereas negative means the absence of normal functioning. So, for example, positive symptoms that people might recognize are schizophrenic people talking to themselves, delusional beliefs, hallucinations, moving erratically. And negative symptoms are something like the inability to feel pleasure, being socially withdrawn, being unable to start or complete tasks, being unable to take care of yourself physically, etc., etc. The negative symptoms have a lot in common with depression and ADHD. This study by Patricia R. Owen at St. Mary's University analyzes 42 Western movies with schizophrenic characters. The vast majority of them displaying positive symptoms, but negative symptoms, very, very rare. And it makes sense, since positive symptoms, hallucinations, talking to yourself weirdly, those are way more visually entertaining than, negative symptoms, which is mostly occurring when you're socially withdrawn and you're depressed. That's not fun to look at. Almost all schizophrenic characters in media are depicted as violent, a trend that Arcane follows. But what makes Arcane unique in their depiction of Jinx is that they put context to her schizophrenia and her violent behavior. She isn't violent because she's mentally ill. She's violent because she lived her whole life in Zon. Her biological parents were murdered by enforcers. Silco took her under his wing, etc., etc. Her visions get an explanation as a manifestation of her guilt over hurting others. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about how media usually depicts schizophrenia. Schizophrenic people are constantly othered, made to be seen as different and dangerous, especially by police shows that need to shock the viewer into watching more. Because person kills person and gets caught kind of tends to get old after 20 years. So these shows will gravitate towards imagining more and more horrendous, inhuman killers. Like in this episode of Criminal Minds, where the dude is schizophrenic and thinks he's a werewolf. So he goes around ripping people's throats out with fake teeth. I mean, he is literally being dehumanized here. And I didn't specifically pick this episode. I clicked on a random episode to just see what Criminal Minds was saying, and they literally dehumanized the schizophrenic character. So when you're constantly put in the position of empathizing with the normal police hunting down the mentally ill killer, you're going to kind of get an us versus them mentality. It's natural. Now, you remember that study I mentioned earlier that found that most depictions of schizophrenia in popular movies only show positive symptoms like hallucinations? Well, it also found that a whopping 83% of movies analyzed showed violent behavior, which is not really a surprise there. Schizophrenic people are generally seen as violent, but what's interesting here is that there are several characters in those movies that are labeled as schizophrenic, but in reality, they simply have hallucinations in a way that is not at all consistent with schizophrenia. So movies and media will label any kind of hallucination as schizophrenia. Another interesting fact is that while it does seem to be the case that schizophrenic people are on average more violent than non-schizophrenic people, there is actually evidence to suggest that schizophrenic people are less violent than depressed people. And I mean, I don't see any movies out here about the violent, crazy, depressed people. So let's say you watch a lot of movies. It's easy to be like, these schizophrenics are these violent, tortured by their visions people, and they're very scary. But the truth is, when you look at cultures which treat schizophrenia as something good or as something neutral, like this study by Tanya Luhrmann did, these schizophrenics are often much happier and their visions do not harass them. She specifically studied them in Accra, Ghana, and Chennai, India, and found, quote, while many of the African and Indian subjects registered predominantly positive experiences with their voices, not one American did. Rather, the U.S. subjects were more likely to report experiences as violent and hateful. and evidence of a sick condition. Yeah, it turns out that if you don't constantly tell people that they're sick monsters, that they don't feel like they're sick monsters. In Chennai, the voices tended to be family members' voices, advising them like an elder would. And in Akragana, where it is culturally accepted that disembodied spirits can speak, the majority of people had good experiences with their voices. Now, that's all good and nice to talk about, but if you want to actually see what it's like to come at hallucinations from a non-judgmental cultural viewpoint, then all you gotta do is watch Res Dogs. Now, Res Dogs is an amazing show about 4 Muskogee children trying to cope with the death of their best friend. But none of that's important for this video, because Bear, one of the characters on that show, sees and talks to a spirit. And for all intents and purposes, from a Western medical point of view, Bear is definitely not schizophrenic, because we don't see any symptoms other than hallucinations. But from a Western media point of view, where hallucinations equals schizophrenia, he definitely is. Now, there is one point later on in the show where the spirit shares info that Bear could not have otherwise known, showing the spirit to be real rather than just part of his imagination, but that's neither here nor there, because even though he sees things, he's not ostracized by his community for it, and that's the important part. He's just allowed to be different. Nobody really tries to change him or show his hallucinations as harmful or make him out to be this big evil guy. The biggest harm is honestly to the spirit, because he's always telling his spirit how much he sucks and how bad he is for a spirit. Interestingly, this analysis of schizophrenia that Western media has could also be applied to people who hear the voice of God in church. I'm sure this won't be controversial at all. Seeing personal spirits is a cultural phenomenon, just as much as hearing the voice of Jesus in church would be. But I wouldn't really call these people schizophrenic, just as you probably wouldn't, just as you probably wouldn't call Bear schizophrenic if you were part of his culture. The media doesn't ever really depict religious people as schizophrenic, so what does schizophrenia actually come down to then in this viewpoint? Kind of just ends up being hallucinating the wrong things at the wrong time. It ends up being defined by how weird and non-socially accepted you get with your visions. If you're a preacher and you hear Jesus occasionally, all Gucci in the coochie. But if you're a homeless man who hears God and tries to spread that gospel yourself, then you're crazy. Schizophrenia. Now, Arcane is interesting because Jinx does hear voices at the wrong time, but we're given enough insight into her mind so she transforms from crazy psychotic terrorist who does violent things to terrorist we have a lot of sympathy for, and we kind of understand where she's coming from. A Beautiful Mind is often claimed to be the best portrayal of schizophrenia in a film. It's about John Nash, a math genius who invents some incredible new mathematical ideas like game theory, which is actually one of the coolest branches of mathematics, but oopsie doopsie, the man is a schizophrenic, and that's no bueno. His poor wife wanted to marry a rich normal man, but instead she married a rich schizophrenic man. Poor her. Spoiler alert, obviously. In this film, Johnny Boy has 3 main hallucinations. His roommate friend, who I'm going to call Chadwick, Chadwick's niece, and William Parcher. Now, William Parcher is an FBI agent who gives him assignments to find Soviet codes embedded in popular magazines, which leads to him doing a lot of really crazy looking stuff, but nothing harmful. Chadwick, he's constantly helping Nash, making sure he eats enough, giving him the courage to go out and socialize, lifting him up, all that stuff. And the niece is kind of just there. Now, the single most violent thing Nash does this entire film is accidentally push his wife slightly when trying to protect her from Parcher, one of his hallucinations. And yet, every character treats all of these visions like they are all equally bad and harmful. Parcher will yell at Nash and demean him, and so yeah, he's not like a great guy to have around, but Chadwick, overall, he's helpful, and the niece does literally nothing wrong the entire film. Again, she barely does anything. And yet, rather than just being a tiny facet of his character that he can live with, as I have met schizophrenics who do, it's kind of seen as this thing he has to overcome, to defeat, so he can receive his big Nobel Prize in the end. Overall, it is a pretty good film. And yet, despite its mostly accuracy, it leaves a bit of a sour taste in my mouth knowing that there are people all over the world, like in Ghana and Chennai, who live with voices and whose voices actually uplift their life rather than something to just overcome. What's more, the film is based on a real-life person, John Nash, and yet they incorrectly imply that he took medications to deal with his schizophrenia, when in reality, he himself said he did it without the use of meds. There's a reason for this very specific slant. The mother of the screenwriter for the movie was a clinical psychologist, so the screenwriter decided to use her mother's perspective when crafting the movie, rather than the perspective of John Nash, the real human being actually living with schizophrenia. What's more, this entire screenplay is based off a biography of John that is unauthorized, meaning at no point did John Nash get to give his own input on his life story. So There's a huge disconnect between what is shown and what really is the experience of schizophrenia, why it flares up, how it feels. If Hollywood's best portrayal of schizophrenia comes completely without input from the person living with it, then it feels a little, bleh. Okay, so you know how this whole video I've been talking about schizophrenia and how it relates to Arcane? Like that's the whole point of this entire video? Okay, what if I told you I'm a big, fat, little liar? That Jinx doesn't actually have schizophrenia. She has BPD, where hallucinations only appear during moments of extreme stress. Now, technically what she has is psychosis, which is a symptom. It just means struggling to understand what's real or what's not. And she could have both. But all her symptoms line up with BPD, not with schizophrenia. And you don't just got to take that from me, random YouTuber. You can take that from this clever lady with a PhD in clinical psychology, who also said she's also got all the characteristics of BPD. And getting these two confused is really not the craziest thing in the world, haha, since until 1980 they were literally considered the same thing, and they have some of the exact same genetic components. Well, anyways, I looked into it, and there is no research of BPD portrayals with hallucinations in media like there is for schizophrenia, like literally none. And, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of movies will label something as schizophrenia if it has hallucinations, even when it really isn't schizophrenia. Looking at classic movies with BPD, couldn't find any that show hallucinations like Jinx has, even though it can be a symptom of BPD, and I, like many others who watched this show, came away with the impression that Jinx is schizophrenic. So when talking about the cultural context of Arcane, it felt more pertinent to speak on schizophrenia than BPD, even though, as it turns out, she probably doesn't have that. Now, as far as I can tell, there are no other high-profile depictions of a BPD person with hallucinations in Hollywood media that exists. So where does that leave us? Well, in BPD, hallucinations, when they happen, they're caused by extreme stress, strong emotions, and in Arcane, that is exactly what we see with Jinx. And the biggest difference overall between schizophrenia and BPD is that people with BPD, they have an intense fear of abandonment, and so their trauma drives them closer to people, rather than further away. And we can see that reflected throughout the series. Vi leaves her to save Vander without her, so she freaks out and she tries to get involved in something that she couldn't possibly understand, leading to great tragedy. And we are constantly reminded and shown this trauma in the show. She sees a girl who looks like Vi, starts to have visions, and goes into a triggered state. And these wide eyes, they show us that she's not in control right now. She's reacting in her traumatized state. Silco, of course, wants her to take a break after this, which she takes personally. And instead, she again decides to go out and do something radical by stealing from Topside. She's acting out because she feels abandoned. She experiences an explosion then, triggering her. And to work out this trauma, she has to go to their old hiding spot. And because of all the stuff that's happened, she starts to have more intense hallucinations here. And when she finally does see Vi, the hallucinations get more serious, talking to people who aren't there. And we start to see actual visions, real visions, not just whispers, of Milo and Clagger. And the more time she spends with Vi, thinking about her and her trauma and all the things that have happened, the worse it gets. Okay, let's talk about the dinner scene, la pièce de résistance, where it all culminates. So in this scene, we have Powder, who wants to choose between being Jinx and being Powder, basically to answer the question, are we still sisters? And she's decorated 2 chairs. She's deciding, basically, whether to go back to being sisters with Vi, or to still be family with Silco. So something I have never mentioned before about Powder, but I think it's important to bring it up now, is that she seems to have the idea that you can only love and be close to one person at a time. At no point in the show does she ever try to befriend anyone at all other than Silco or Vi, even though we see lots of characters who she could have attached to that are not at all mean to her. She also asks Vi to shoot Caitlyn so that they can go back to being sisters, and it can be hard to tell, but she's definitely being genuine when she says this. Otherwise, why not just kill Caitlyn right off the bat? She set the Powder chair opposite Caitlyn, implying there's a choice for Vi to make between Caitlyn and Powder, and she set Vi and Silco's chairs opposite each other at the table, implying there's a choice for Jinx to make between Vi and Silco, and the Jinx chair, notably, is right beside Silco. This whole scene, it is clear how badly she wants to go back to being Vi's little protected Powder. She brought them to the old Shimmer factory where the original split between the 2 sisters happened. When she asks Vi to shoot Caitlyn and Vi refuses, she gets so angry because in her mind, where people can only love one person, this is like Vi saying, I love Caitlyn more than you. When Vi tells her that they'll leave and they'll never come back, she gets genuinely hopeful again. and Milo's voice comes in as a manifestation of that doubt. Silco then tells her that he would never give her up, and he loves her no matter what. And you can see how much that meant to her, especially given that he has no emotional attachments really outside of her, which in her misguided view of love, that's the only way for her to truly be loved. Then Caitlyn gets a gun on her and Vi begs Powder instead of Caitlyn, saying no, please. And look at how angry she is. And I'd be angry too. I mean, she pulls a gun on you and she's begging Powder, not Caitlyn. I mean, of course she feels unloved, unprotected, especially after hearing how much Silco still has love for her. A voice comes in her head saying, which in my mind means that Powder, who is her child self trying to choose who to love between Vi and Silco, leaves the building for the protective Jinx persona to take over. She goes to attack Caitlyn, but it's only when Vi yells for Caitlyn to stop does Jinx actually stop. When Vi finally actually starts defending Jinx, we can see the look of relief on Powder's face, like Vi was still defending her from Milo bullying her all those years ago. So she disarms Caitlyn, but she's still got a lot to process here. We see the psychosis oncoming before anyone even says anything to her. After all, originally, she wanted Vi to choose between her and Caitlyn. But since Caitlyn escaped and Jinx now holds the gun, she's in the position of making the choice herself, something she absolutely did not want to do, otherwise she would have done it already. And to make matters worse, they both start talking to her, bringing this conflict to the forefront of her mind, with Vi screaming at her to remember all of her trauma. It's too much, and she breaks. And in her traumatized state, when Silco goes to stop Vi from shouting at Powder, which is clearly triggering her, again, showing his protective instinct and love for her, she hears a pistol being fired and instinctively goes to defend herself, or possibly defend Vi, without realizing that it was Silco trying to defend her from Vi. See, Silco was doing exactly what Powder wanted Vi to do. Silco was eliminating the choice of love for her, and her mind proving that he truly loved her. Yet because of her defensive, traumatized state, she killed him. And that's fucking tragic. Honestly, a part of me wonders if Jinx would have killed anyone if Caitlyn hadn't escaped and pointed a gun at her. Maybe left them tied up, but I don't really see her killing either Silco or Vi. Even Caitlyn feels like a bit of a stretch because that would ensure that Vi hates her forever, and clearly she wants to go back to being Powder. Anyways, where does that leave us? Why bring up all that cultural context for Arcane? Well, I really like that nobody treats Jinx like she's crazy and tries to change her delusions like in A Beautiful Mind. I think that's a really novel and good idea for how to approach psychosis in Western media. I like that the animators put so much effort into showing exactly what her triggers were from her facial expressions. Think about how difficult that must have been. I like that Jinx's pattern of violence is extremely consistent throughout season 1, rather than, oh my god, she's so crazy, she's gonna attack anyone. Every time she acts out, there is a reason. I think these things are new and interesting for a Western piece of media to show. You don't see crazy characters humanized so much. And for contrast, in A Beautiful Mind, it seems like he can't give in to any delusion, even though Chadwick is a friendly, helpful delusion. And it comes across as a very controlling perspective. What's so refreshing in Arcane is no one's saying that, damn, you're so crazy because you have these hallucinations and stuff. They're saying, damn, you're so crazy because you keep trying to kill people. Stop trying to kill people, girl. And because she steals from people and stuff. But hey, they're not judging her for the delusion. That's genuinely really awesome. And that makes sense in the Arcane universe because they have no media by which to judge anyone else. Even Caitlyn, the only character you can argue who is trying to change or shame Jinx for seeing visions, she doesn't really care about any of that. She's just worried about the safety of Piltover, and, you know, good for her. I also like that they really dive deep into what makes a mental break happen, how it's stress-related, and how you can see it happen before your very eyes. In A Beautiful Mind, some of these things are implied, but mostly you don't see why he imagines the things he does. What triggers a break, even though the delusions often correspond to how a person is feeling and what they know about the world. Jinx having hallucinations doesn't just feel like a single challenge for her to overcome or an, oh my god, look how crazy and dangerous she is. It adds to her character in a way that emotionally resonates with the audience. It's why people cried like a baby when she killed Silco, but nobody cries when John Nash accidentally hurts his wife because of a vision he had. Because in A Beautiful Mind, Schizophrenia is the character. In Arcane, it's just a small part of her. Like and subscribe, it's a good video. Please give me money on Patreon.